I am surprised. I am very surprised, simply because I did not envision within this current Broadway theatre trip telling you that my favourite show is a new musical about robots that fall in love. Oh my god, hey, welcome back. My name is Mickey Jo and I'm obsessed with all things theatre. And this is my review of the brand new Broadway musical Maybe Happy Ending, which I saw on one of its final press performances just before it opened officially at the Belasco Theatre here in New York. I'm a UK-based professional theatre critic, currently visiting New York to see as much theatre as possible, reviewing many shows as well as sharing vlog content from my trip. You may be watching this on my theatre-themed YouTube channel. Hello to you. Don't you love this bucket hat? Isn't it cute? If you are listening to this on a podcast platform, hello to you as well. Make sure to follow me on there for many more reviews from worldwide coming very soon. This is the third full review I will have shared from this trip, but I have many more shows to tell you about, lots of new shows including Death Becomes Her and Swept Away, and also the many shows that I saw off-Broadway. But today we are talking all about Maybe Happy Ending, which is this really lovely new musical that I am delighted to tell you about. This charmed me so hugely, it moved me to tears. It's a beautiful show. I really didn't see this coming, other than the fact that people had been stopping me on the street to talk to me about this show in the week leading up to me seeing it. People had been like, on the rare occasion people recognized me, this was the show they wanted to tell me about and the show they were hoping that I would see. And so thrilled that it was as lovely as people told me it would be. And that's something I hope to tell you about in today's new review. Now, if you have had the good fortune to see this already on Broadway, let everyone know what you thought in the comments section down below. Very intrigued to hear what other people think. Also, what would be very handy is if you could let me know which other Broadway show currently running or recently opened you are most eager to hear me talking about. There are reviews coming up for many of them, but I would love to know what you want me to prioritize because there are lots of videos to make. Also, like I said, make sure you're subscribed to me here on YouTube so you don't miss any of the upcoming content. There's a little button somewhere beneath my face that you can turn on that will give you notifications anytime I post a new video, which is roughly every 2 to 3 days. And if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, then make sure you're following me there as well. And go find me across the musical theatre internet. I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, and I'm on the app formerly known as Twitter as MickeyJoTheatre. For now, though, that is more than enough spiel. Let me tell you all about the new musical Maybe Happy Ending, beginning with what the heck is it? So, Maybe Happy Ending is an original South Korean one-act musical written by Will Aaronson and Hugh Park that had a Korean language production before making its way to Broadway via a regional US production in Atlanta, I believe. The theatre industry and myself are both very guilty of focusing sort of narrowly on Broadway and the West End as the only places where theatre is happening, as well as the only possible forum for musical theatre success, but worth pointing out that regardless of this show's Broadway lifespan, it has had multiple runs in Seoul, as well as in China and Japan. And the show is still set in Korea, features Korean characters, but doesn't really utilize Korean language. Let me tell you a little bit more about this plot. It concerns two helper bots who are now living as neighbors in a retirement facility for retired helper bots. Let me tell you what a helper bot is. So this exists in a sort of a dystopian, futuristic world in which you have these super lifelike, realistic humanoid robots who live in people's homes, who are their property ostensibly, and fulfill tasks for them, as is their programming. They are programmed to be helpful and fulfill tasks and provide information. We meet Oliver, who was a Helperbot 3, and Claire, who was a slightly more sophisticated and slightly more advanced Helperbot 5. The differences between those are very interesting, and we'll get to them. Prior to his retirement, Oliver lived with a single gentleman who was a great lover of jazz music, something that he passed on to his Helperbot, Oliver, who became sort of like a placeholder for his son, with whom he had an estranged relationship, something we find out more about as the piece continues. But he gifted Oliver with a subscription to a monthly jazz magazine, as well as a plant, and it's those things that Oliver is clinging to as he is living in Helperbot retirement for years, waiting for James to come and retrieve him, because he doesn't quite understand the circumstances of his retirement. It's a little bit heartbreaking. Claire, meanwhile, being a slightly more advanced Helperbot, is a little more cognizant of her situation and of her retirement, and she is aware of the factors that led to her arrival at this facility, of the breakdown of the relationship that was occurring in the home that she was living/working in. And at the beginning of the show, we meet Oliver going about a repetitive daily routine that he continues for years. He is having conversations with his plant, he is awaiting the monthly delivery of his jazz magazine, and he is firm in the belief that James is coming to retrieve him. We can tell that this is someone who does not behave with traditional human emotions. He is unflinchingly optimistic in the face of abject loneliness. Claire, meanwhile, is more emotionally astute, but as Oliver will later point out to her, a little less technologically durable. So they come to meet when she knocks on his door because she needs to borrow his charger. She is having issues with battery retention, and in many ways, in 2024, aren't we all, really? And though they've been neighbours for a considerable amount of time, this finally introduces the two of them to each other. Oliver is indifferent to the idea of her entering into his space and his life, and sort of instantly resentful of her being a Helperbot 5 and quick to tell her about her technological shortcomings in comparison to him, even though she's a more advanced subsequent model. The way that this manifests for them as characters and for us as an audience is that she just seems a little bit more worldly and a little bit more emotionally adult. And in the story that will follow, and beneath this whole thing, runs an undercurrent where it feels like we're talking a little bit here about neurodiversity as well. You have these characters who pass entirely as human beings because they are hyper-realistic, and they end up going on a road trip together to try and fulfill some personal goals, and because of unforeseen circumstances end up having to book into a very seedy motel for a one-night stay and convince the person on the check-in desk that they are not robots because they'll get in legal trouble for being out unsupervised because they're meant to be staying in this facility. And so they are, for all intents and purposes and for all perception, regular human beings set apart only by the way that they engage with society and the way that they act. So it kind of speaks to the neurodivergent perspective and the neurodivergent existence, but using this futuristic robot concept as a metaphor for that. And the narrative becomes these two robots taking this road trip to a different part of Korea and, finding common ground and starting to understand each other a little bit more and finding out more about each other's history and developing more compassion and concern and empathy for each other, but still, a lot of charm being found in the way that they navigate the world and in the way that they interface with each other. There's a scene as they are beginning the road trip when it occurs to them that it may be beneficial for them to develop a believable backstory about being a couple, and so together they sort of improvise the nature of what that might be and where it is that they may have met and fallen in love and the details of that relationship. And it's witty, it's also very charming. What's interesting is the narrative that takes place over between 90 and 100 minutes, I would say, in just one uninterrupted act. Goes a little beyond where you might expect it to. There are sort of more pronounced spoilers from this part onwards. If you want to skip ahead to the next section, they will be comparatively spoiler-free. But continuing on, I should tell you that the purpose for their road trip is for Oliver to be reunited with his owner James, in spite of the number of years that have passed since he last saw him. And without it being a total surprise, when they arrive at James's residence, they find out that he has since passed away and his son is living there. His son, who has a lot of frustrations around Oliver's existence as this sort of perfect son who was part of James's life in a way that he was not. There's a palpable resentment there, and we come to understand that it was because they moved back in together, or that James moved in with his son in his later years, that he made the decision to retire Oliver, even though he didn't want to, even though he was very close to him. Now, Claire's reason for wanting to participate on this road trip was wanting to go to that island and see the fireflies, because she loves fireflies, and this is something that they then go and do together. And it's a beautiful sort of a silent moment when they suddenly see a single firefly and then they see them around everywhere, and they see a certain amount of themselves in the fireflies. They even refer to them as like tiny little robots in the forest. But where this might be a beautiful enough ending to a cartoon version of this story, maybe Happy Ending continues on a little bit longer, because we truly do talk about this idea of what a happy ending can look like and what the happiness and resolution can look like. And key to this is the notion that these robots, once they are given their passwords by their owners, have the possibility, have the option to erase their own memories. Now, after returning back, even though they had made a pinky promise not to fall in love with each other during this time together, we find out Oliver tells Claire he couldn't keep the promise, and then she says she couldn't either, and that they are now in love. And they spend a short amount of time being in love before reckoning with the reality that both of them, in their own ways, are slowly breaking down, that they are not going to exist forever. This, obviously, even though they're robots, speaks to the human experience of life being finite, of love and everything within that having an end date. So again, even though it's this science fiction, futuristic plot, it's speaking very directly to realities of the human experience in a very powerful emotional metaphor. But after reflecting briefly on that together in a very pragmatic way, they decide that they should mutually erase their own memories of each other so that neither of them has to live with the pain of being without the other one. They reflect on love being this very difficult thing that will ultimately result in a lot of sadness as well. Heartbreakingly, then, we see the result of this where their first interaction within the plot plays out again, only they seem not to know each other. However, devastatingly, there is a moment where Oliver, as an aside, turns to his plant who he speaks to and says not to tell her, not to let Claire know, indicating to us, the audience, that he decided not to erase his memories. He decided to keep his memory of her, even though that would mean the pain of losing her. And what happens thereafter, we don't know. Whether the whole thing repeats, whether they once again fall in love. There's a beauty and a pain to it. It is wonderfully bittersweet. It is so small and self-contained, and it's, you know, it has such a narrow focus on this little chapter in the lives of these two robot characters, and yet it speaks to such huge emotions. It speaks about mortality, and it speaks about love and the inherent juxtaposition of those two things. It talks about the sorrow and the joy of love and of life and the human experience and what that means to robots who can look at it in a very analytical way, but who can't separate themselves from feeling the emotions of it. Like I said, it also has the metaphorical link to talking about sort of navigating the world with a different perspective on it, one that feels othered, one that feels different. And finally, this futuristic science fiction nature of the plot being, again, a lens through which we can see something timeless and contemporary and real and honest. Let me tell you now a little bit more about the material, about the music, and about the creative choices as well that make this production. So like I said, written by Will Aaronson and Hugh Park. Will Aaronson wrote the music, Hugh Park wrote the lyrics, and they collaborated together on the book. All of the writing, deeply charming. The voices created for these two different robot characters are so brilliant. Oliver has a sort of a stubbornness. It's a little bit Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory-esque, the way that he is very reluctant to be corrected about everything. He is also that little bit less independent than Claire. He has a function where he has to say you're welcome anytime someone says thank you. Claire is a little bit more willful, a little bit less naive than he is. She's a little bit sassy and sarcastic with him as well, which makes their first meetings brilliant, as well as the rest of their relationship. Tonally, it feels very lighthearted and charming throughout, with a slightly solemn quality lingering in the back seat. But comedically, it's at its peak when they are checking into this very raunchy motel, and the motel clerk says, "How are you planning to charge this?" And Oliver has this outrage, thinking that he's talking about charging Claire, and that's the reason why they're stopping, is because Claire needs to charge. And so Oliver reacts by saying, this is my wife. But it's also bittersweet and poignant and beautiful in the way that a Studio Ghibli film would be, in the way that a Pixar film would be. People have said this feels a little bit like WALL-E, and from the perspective of two robots in a futuristic society finding love after a sort of an initially challenged encounter. Sure, it's also a little bit Toy Story, because we explore the feelings of the things that we discard from our lives. Much of the emotional heart of the show is the consideration of how these robots feel after being retired by their owners, these robots whose entire purpose and function is to serve and to help and to aid, who are no longer able to do that, who are trying to figure out what is then going to bring them meaning in their own independent lives. And I would love to see some kind of an animated version of this, because tonally it does feel like it lives in that very similar realm. It reminded me both musically and tonally, in fact, of Steven Universe. It was the same kind of gentle and bright and charming, very much in the face of the usual style of like Broadway musical. If something like The Great Gatsby, like A Wonderful World, the Louis Armstrong musical, is giving you big sets and big flash and fireworks and dance routines and spinning revolves and all these things, there are some very impressive visual elements in maybe Happy Ending as well. But the story and the tone and the nature of the identity of this musical, so different from anything else that we're seeing on a New York stage right now, I think. In terms of other theatre pieces, it reminded me the most closely of something like Two Strangers Carry a Cake Across New York, and it was every bit as charming and as lovely. Now, after hearing me describe this show, you may or may not be surprised to learn that the music is all very jazz-inspired. Obviously, there's a feature of the plot where we are talking a lot about Oliver's favourite jazz musicians, and when he comes to choose a human name for himself, he decides that it should be Nat King Cole, and he has very much adopted this part of his personality from James, who he admired and looked up to so much. And we hear a lot of jazz music performed by a jazz singer character as well. But the rest of the score also has that very light, easy jazz quality to it as well. And again, feels a little bit Ghibli, feels a little bit Steven Universe. It's not jazz like Days of Wine and Roses jazz, like it doesn't have that same kind of a weight to it. This is light-hearted, this is charm, this is effervescent and soft and careful. It's sort of adolescent and naive in a way, like the characters are, but it also has that playfulness to it. It has that sense of adventure to it and that sense of an early blossoming romance. The character of this score and the nature of the show are so obviously compatible. From first listen, there weren't a wealth of standout songs and melodies that immediately spoke to me afterwards, but they're so faithfully in service of each dramatic moment. It so makes sense for this to be a musical story, and it infuses it with that dreamy sense of charm and wonder. And this becomes an adventure, and it becomes a love story, and it becomes this bittersweet, lovely thing. And the songs are so essential to that. Now, the production has been directed by the wonderful Tony Award-winning director Michael Arden, who increasingly is becoming one of my favourite and most trusted Broadway directors. He was recently behind the wonderful revival of Jason Robert Brown's Parade, and he is very busy on the back of that success with multiple projects in development at the moment, including maybe Happy Ending. And this dreamy, romantic levity that he brings to this show that could become very sorrowful is what makes it so perfect, and is what is making me want to go and see it very badly again and again and again, and made me fall so readily in love with it in the first place. It's just such a beautiful creative marriage of all of these different elements that achieve the same thing. It delivers such a perfect version of what this show is trying to do and what this show is trying to be. It has such a clear and unique identity, and it's so unlike a lot of what we see on Broadway, like I said, but it's so theatrically fulfilling, and it's such wonderful storytelling, it's such brilliant performances that we'll talk about in the final section, but all of this overseen beautifully by Michael Arden. It really is such beautiful work done on this show. I'm going to talk about some specific moments, but because those will have spoilers, I will save them to the end of this section and warn you again so you can skip ahead. But let me tell you a little bit more about the aesthetics and the visuals and the design of this show. Now, this set is a brilliant, high-tech creative collaboration between Dane Laffrey, who did the scenic design, as well as additional video design. The video design is credited to George Reeve, and Ben Stanton did the lighting, and all three of these elements come together where we have these shutters that part in three different directions to reveal these widening rectangles through which we peer to see the lives of these robots. It reveals their intimate little retired homes, these little boxes that they live in. Very familiar of like a Bunny Christie set design, very familiar of the Company revival of a few years ago, a lot of the same kind of visual ideas. One of the most theatrical and emotive uses of video design is we see these pre-recorded memories of their interactions with the humans who they served projected across the entire set as they access these memories from their storage, and they inform decisions that they make and emotions that they feel towards different situations. We see them blasted huge across the space in literal flashbacks. Now, when Claire and Oliver get in the car, this happens on the very front of the stage, and they come out of their homes together and walk through what has been a shifting proscenium and sort of break out into the open world. When we then see them traveling, when we then see them boarding onto a ship and going to this island, once we get to the island, it feels like we are in a distinct and new world, but there could be a little more done in the traveling phase. Like, it suggests a change in location, and it suggests driving down a highway in Korea and all that stuff. There could be a little bit more to suggest the idea of them breaking out into the open world and suddenly different surroundings and what this means to them. That sense of freedom, but also slightly of danger as well, and the difference with that from the very sheltered, cozy, curated lives that they've been living just hours before. I also want to tell you about the design team for costumes, hair and wig design and makeup. Clint Ramos did the costume designs, Tsuki Tsujimoto did the makeup design, and Craig Franklin Miller did the hair and wig design, which is some of the most interesting because the way that they are crafted to look like these pristine humanoid and human passing robots, so interesting because there's just enough features, and it's particularly in the wigs that give them that sort of an uncanny valley quality of looking not quite real, this sort of an artificial sense that is afforded to them through the design, and the expressive uses of colour also very fun on their design as well. Now, before I tell you about the performances, I do want to highlight a few key creative moments in this production that utterly took my breath away. These are going to be spoilers. I know I would hate for you, if you're planning to see this production, if you will get the chance to see this production, I would hate for you to hear about them first from me rather than experiencing them for yourself. So if you haven't seen it yet, and if you don't want the spoilers, skip ahead to the next section. But there is a lot of really beautiful stuff that happens to do with the fireflies when they first see the fireflies, and we see these lights suddenly flashing up all over the stage, and there is this beautiful moment where we've only been hearing the music from some unseen location up to this point, but the shifting proscenium parts away to reveal an open stage, and this revolves that they've used on a couple of occasions with 4 musicians in a string quartet rotating around a central pianist, and something about this reveal of members of the band with these fireflies as these very clearly artificial robots are suddenly encountering life and nature and reality in all of its beautiful possibility, I think is the most stunning moment. There's not a lot that it literally means in terms of its storytelling, but it's one of those things that's just hugely emotionally impactful regardless. Like, without seeing the show a bunch more times and really interrogating my feelings on it, I don't think I could tell you why that moment made me cry, but it did. It was beautiful. And I think at the heart of it, it is about that conflict between the real and the artificial. I also think, talking about the structuring of the writing, there's an awful lot to be said by the way the story is revealed to us, and the way that these memories cascade, and the way that we are able to find out in real time the circumstances under which Oliver was retired, and we sort of discover that as he does. And there's a real gut punch in the interaction he has with James's son, where we hear James refer to him as his father's perfect son, and we can see the resentment there and the frustration there. There's also so many painfully beautiful moments where Claire knows a little bit more about what's going to happen to Oliver than he does, which then contradicts what happens at the end with that moment where we find out that he has decided to keep his memories of her even though she hasn't, which is super painful and super fascinating because throughout the rest of the show she has been the one who knows a little bit more than he does. She has been that little bit less naive, that little bit more worldly, that little bit sort of more emotionally intelligent and less childlike, and he then sort of puts himself in a position where he has the upper hand here because he decides not to tell her that he's doing this or that he's planned this or that he's done it after the fact, and she goes back to not knowing who he is, and he keeps this beautiful memory of their meaningful relationship together just because he doesn't want to let that go. And that, I think, is lovely. It says a lot about why bother to live, why bother to love in the first place when everything eventually is going to end and eventually become sorrow. Oh my gosh, I also have to tell you about the moment that they actually decide to, or they seemingly both erase their memories of each other. We see them transformed metaphorically into two fireflies, one of which via lighting flies up the proscenium, but the other one of which flies out into the auditorium and sort of flashes at various points on its journey up past the mezzanine, past the balcony where I was sitting, and up into the roof of the gorgeous Belasco Theatre. That was one of those stunning magic moments, and it really works because there hasn't been too much sort of like flash and magic up to that point. It's otherwise a very sort of just like traditional, it would be a very normal two-hander of a show if it wasn't for the fact they were robots. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit more about those robots. Let me finish by telling you about the performances of Darren, Criss, Helen, Shen, and the cast of Maybe Happy Ending. So Darren, Criss, and Helen Shen play Oliver and Claire. Darren in particular, the way that he plays this robotic energy in his physicality and in his demeanour, and in the way that he very steadily and only really towards the end of the thing and from his relationship with Claire onwards begins to sort of evolve in his human qualities and in his emotional spectrum. That development in his character is wonderful because at the beginning of the thing he moves and he sort of exists in the space in a way that is very robotic and is very precise, and it's characterized along with that as well, with this charmingly and hilariously stubborn quality as well, and this slightly argumentative, insistent quality, and his buttons that Claire finds both easy and entertaining to push. But as he maintains that rigidity in his physicality but softens a little bit, and we begin to see his heart through all of that, it's wonderful. I love the way he vocally characterizes it as well. There's such an innocence and such a naivety to what he does. And Helen Shen, brilliant opposite him as Claire. It's a really lovely performance. It's her Broadway debut as well, incidentally. And it's the moments where we see her sort of burdened by the weight of knowledge and concern for him that she gets to do her most meaningful work. We get to learn a little bit about her backstory as well, about the circumstances that led to her retirement and the weight of that she carries with her, and why that has afforded her a certain perspective on love and relationships and the inevitability of their demise. Both of them vocally very perfect for this style of music. It's light, it's jazzy, it's sweet, it's smooth. And if we're talking about vocals, we have to talk about Des Duron, who recurs and pops up on various parts of the set, giving us jazz vocals as Gil Brentley, with this small onstage cast finally being completed by Marcus Choi, who plays both James and his son Junso. And utterly different, completely different in both of those roles. He plays paternal and warm, and also then plays this this sort of coldness and this regret and angst that culminates in one very lovely scene that fulfills his arc very nicely towards the end with Oliver. Like I keep saying, it does have this sort of an animated quality to it as well, in the way that we encounter all of these characters and the way in which they are portrayed, but that's also a big part of what makes it feel so new and so different and so fresh for Broadway musical theatre. And before I completely lose daylight gushing over this show, I just want to talk about what this show does differently, because there are so many new musicals trying to deliver something big by portraying something big, or trying to do something bold and declarative, some of which works really well and playing these huge heightened emotions. And here you have a show that is making you feel things by demonstrating and illustrating a circumstance none of us have experienced, by portraying something seemingly not relatable whatsoever, but they access such an honest humanity and such universal themes. Like they're making you feel the same things that The Notebook makes you feel in a much less obvious way. They're not telling you an obviously traumatic story. They're doing something very small, very subtle. It's not even human characters, but what they feel is real. The love that they find is real. The decisions that they make are real, and it forces us to consider things in our own lives and consider our own humanity and consider the nature of love and what that means to us and a happy ending and what that can look like. And it's just one of those really beautiful stories for that. And it's the same way that like a Finding Nemo has done that, like a My Neighbor Totoro has done that. So many beautiful stories. Steven Universe, again, so many wonderful, charming things that speak to young audiences, but really speak to people of all ages that have this really wise perspective on life and love and partnership and loneliness. And smartly, they realize it doesn't need to be big, and it doesn't need to be declarative, and it doesn't need to be epic, it doesn't need to be long, it doesn't need to be 2 acts or 3 acts, it doesn't even need to be humans, it just needs to be true. And that is what Maybe Happy Ending is. And I don't know how else to tell you, having only seen this show the once, amongst a lot of other things, having only heard the songs the once, there's more I will be able to say about it, hopefully when I have seen it again, when I have listened to it again. I'm not going to stop talking about this show. I don't know how long it's going to run on Broadway, because it's not this huge, well-known name thing. It's not the most commercially viable of projects, like Darren Criss is doing this, but it's not loaded with big star names. What it is incredibly deserving of an audience. This is my biggest Broadway recommendation right now. I don't see how anyone could not fall in love with this show. I think it's beautiful. I think it's smart. I think it's sincere. I think it's charming. If you like any of those animated films that I mentioned, if you liked Two Strangers Carry a Cake Across New York, if you like just lovely, beautiful theatrical storytelling that is both simple and complex and ornate, go and see Maybe Happy Ending on Broadway. I beg of you. I think it's wonderful. In the meantime, those have been all of my thoughts about this show. I hope that you enjoyed this review, whether you were listening to me or watching me right here on YouTube. Make sure to follow, to subscribe, to turn on notifications, to go find me on other places on the musical theatre internet, Instagram, TikTok, the app formerly known as Twitter, and stay tuned for many more Broadway reviews, as well as my Broadway vlog series coming very soon. Don't forget to comment down below with your thoughts about Maybe Happy Ending if you have been lucky enough to see it already at the Belasco Theatre on Broadway. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!